wife tried to break up with her best friend for no reason after a disastrous wedding, but the disgusting truth came out that exposed my wife as a manipulator and a liar. My wife, Sarah, and I had been married for about 5 years. Sarah is a teacher, a passionate one at that, always staying late to help her students or spending her weekends grading papers. She's the kind of person who forms deep, meaningful connections wherever she goes, and that's how she met Lisa. Lisa was a colleague Sarah had worked with briefly at a summer camp for kids with learning disabilities about 5 years before this particular day. They had kept in touch sporadically through phone calls and the occasional lunch or dinner, even though Lisa lived just 10 miles away. This was pre-internet, so their communication was mostly confined to the phone. It wasn't an everyday friendship, more like a check-in every few months. Lisa's life was starkly different from ours. She was living with a man named Carl, a hard-working but rough-around-the-edges sort of guy. Carl was what you'd call a good old boy, someone who prided himself on his manual labor job, was fiercely independent, and didn't take kindly to what he saw as unnecessary luxuries or modern conveniences. He was mean-spirited at times, not outright abusive as far as I knew, but certainly not the warm, supportive partner Sarah and I tried to be for each other. The occasion that brought us all together was Lisa and Carl's wedding. I wasn't particularly close to Lisa, but Sarah felt a sense of duty, maybe even pity. Lisa had confided in Sarah about some of the tougher times with Carl, and I think Sarah saw the wedding as a way to show support. Plus, they had a 2-year-old son together, and Sarah had a soft spot for kids. The wedding was set in the rural outskirts, a place that felt miles away from our suburban neighborhood, even though it was just a short drive. We arrived at this dilapidated, barn-like venue that Carl's family owned. It was rustic, to put it kindly, but the decorations showed that Lisa had put in a lot of effort. There were wildflowers on the tables and fairy lights strung up everywhere. It was the kind of charm you find in a country living magazine, albeit a little more worn around the edges in real life. Carl's side of the family was exactly what I had expected. Loud, boisterous, and a little rough. They weren't unfriendly, but there was a palpable edge to their interactions, a sort of competitiveness that came out in everything from casual conversations to the games of horseshoes set up outside. It was clear Carl was the alpha, and his word was law. Lisa, on the other hand, seemed almost out of place. She was soft-spoken, polite, and wore a constant, somewhat nervous smile. She floated around the venue, trying to make sure everything was perfect despite the chaos around her. I could see why Sarah liked her. She had a kindness and a resilience that was hard not to admire. The ceremony was short and sweet. Carl looked uncomfortable in his suit, shifting his weight from foot to foot as the officiant spoke. Lisa, on the other hand, looked radiant in her simple white dress. Her eyes glistened with tears as she said her vows, and for a moment it seemed like everything might actually turn out all right for them. Then came the reception. The moment the formalities were over, Carl and his buddies cracked open their first beers, and the real party began. The atmosphere shifted from a quaint country wedding to a full-blown hoedown. The music was loud, the laughter louder, and the alcohol flowed freely. Sarah and I tried to blend in, chatting with other guests, and enjoying the surprisingly good barbecue that Carl's cousins had prepared. It was during one of these conversations that I learned more about Carl. One of his friends, already a few beers in, started telling stories about Carl's infamous temper. There were tales of bar fights, shouting matches at work, and even an incident where Carl had gotten into it with a neighbor over a property line dispute. Each story seemed to be told with a mix of admiration and caution, as if Carl's temper was both a badge of honor and a warning. Sarah had always been the type to see the good in people, so when she found me later, I didn't tell her everything I'd heard. She was busy helping Lisa with some last-minute details, and hadn't seen much of Carl's behavior. When she asked how I was holding up, I just smiled and said, "It's a lively crowd." As the night wore on, things started to get more unruly. Carl's friends were getting louder, and a couple of them had already started arguing over some minor slight. Lisa was doing her best to keep things under control, but it was clear she was outmatched. At one point, I saw Carl grab her arm a little too forcefully, whispering something in her ear that made her eyes widen with fear. I wanted to step in, but Sarah, always the peacemaker, put a hand on my arm and shook her head. "Let's just keep an eye on things," she said softly. "We don't want to make it worse." And so we did. We watched as the party spiraled further into chaos, the laughter turning harsher, the music becoming a background to the shouting. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing you couldn't stop it, but hoping the damage wouldn't be too severe. Eventually, Lisa managed to get Carl to leave the party and head home. The guests started to disperse after, some stumbling to their cars, others crashing on makeshift beds in the barn. Sarah and I offered to help clean up, but Lisa, ever the gracious hostess, insisted we go home. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It means a lot." We left with heavy hearts, knowing that Lisa's life was likely to be filled with more nights like this. On the drive home, Sarah was quiet, lost in thought. I reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "I just wish there was more we could do." That night, as we lay in bed, Sarah and I talked about our own relationship, about how grateful we were for the love and respect we had for each other. We vowed to be there for Lisa as much as we could, to offer her a safe space whenever she needed it. In the weeks and months that followed, Sarah stayed in close contact with Lisa, checking in on her regularly. We had them over for dinner a few times, trying to give Lisa a break from the tension of her own home. Carl was always polite, but distant, never quite fitting in with our circle of friends. One evening, about a year after the wedding, Lisa showed up at our door, her eyes red from crying. She had left Carl. She didn't go into details, but it was clear that things had gotten worse. We welcomed her with open arms, offering her a place to stay until she could get back on her feet. About a year after Lisa moved out of Carl's place and started to rebuild her life, we got another unexpected invitation from her. She had met someone new, a guy named Dave, and they were getting married. This time, the wedding was planned to be much more subdued, a simple ceremony at a local restaurant followed by a small reception. We were happy for her, but a bit apprehensive, given our experience with her last wedding. We received the invitation about a week in advance. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock. As luck would have it, I had a lacrosse game that same day, which meant I would be cutting it close. I told Sarah to go ahead without me, and I would meet her there as soon as I could. The game was a nail-biter, one of those matches that goes into overtime, leaving everyone on edge. By the time I managed to leave, it was already 4:05, and I knew I'd be late. I drove as quickly as I could, navigating the weekend traffic, and finally pulled into the restaurant parking lot around 4:15. As I walked in, I noticed the unmistakable signs of a party that had started well before I arrived. There were about 25 guests in all, a mix of Lisa's friends, family, and a few people I didn't recognize. The atmosphere was lively, to say the least. I spotted Sarah near the back, talking with Lisa, who looked beautiful in a simple, elegant dress. But what caught my eye immediately was the fact that Lisa, Dave, and his best man were already drunk. I made my way over to Sarah, who greeted me with a wry smile. "You missed the start," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Did I miss much?" I asked, taking in the scene. "Just the drinking," she replied. "It's been quite the pre-party." The actual ceremony, when it finally happened, was brief. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. Lisa and Dave stood together, swaying slightly, as a friend of theirs officiated. The vows were slurred but heartfelt, and when they kissed, the room erupted into cheers. It was clear that everyone was there to have a good time, and the formalities were just a minor interruption. The reception that followed was more of the same. Shots were passed around liberally, and the bar was the most popular spot in the room. There was a minimum amount of food. A few trays of finger sandwiches, some chips and dips, nothing substantial enough to balance out the copious amounts of alcohol being consumed. I found a seat next to Sarah and watched as the festivities unfolded. The kid, Lisa and Carl's son, now about 3 years old, was running around the room in just a diaper. At some point, he had taken off all his clothes, and no one seemed particularly concerned. He was a blur of motion, weaving between legs and chairs, laughing and screaming with the kind of pure joy only a child can muster. Despite the chaos, there was something endearing about the whole scene. Lisa seemed genuinely happy, her face flushed with laughter and drink. Dave, though clearly inebriated, was attentive and affectionate. It was messy, loud, and a little out of control, but it was also a celebration of new beginnings. As the night wore on, the crowd thinned out. Some guests left early, unable to keep up with the drinking. Others settled into quieter conversations, the initial frenzy giving way to a more relaxed atmosphere. I managed to grab a few words with Dave, who, despite his drunken state, seemed like a decent guy. He told me about his work, his hopes for the future with Lisa, and his excitement about becoming a step. It was clear he cared for Lisa and her son, and that gave me a bit of reassurance. Sarah and I stayed until the end, helping Lisa clean up once most of the guests had left. As we gathered up plates and glasses, Lisa pulled us aside, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I know it was a bit wild, but it means a lot that you were here." "Of course," Sarah replied, hugging her tightly. "We wouldn't miss it for the world." We finally left around midnight, exhausted but happy. On the drive home, Sarah and I talked about the evening, marveling at how different it had been from Lisa's first wedding. It was clear that this time, despite the chaos, there was a genuine sense of joy and optimism. Lisa was starting a new chapter, and it felt like she was finally moving towards the happiness she deserved. As the evening continued to unfold, the best man's speech was a moment that none of us would forget. His name was Greg, a childhood friend of Dave's, and he was visibly the most inebriated person at the wedding. If you've ever seen the character Steve Buscemi played in The Wedding Singer, you'll get a sense of what Greg was like that night. It was eerily similar. Greg stumbled up to the front of the room, holding a glass of whiskey in one hand and the microphone in the other. His tie was loosened, his shirt untucked, and he swayed slightly as he stood there, grinning like a fool. "Ladies and gentlemen," he slurred, raising his glass, "I've known Dave since we were kids. We've been through thick and thin together, and I've got to tell you, this guy is something else." He paused, taking a long swig from his glass, while the guests exchanged nervous glances. "Dave has always been there for me, you know? Like, when I lost my job and my apartment, who let me crash on their couch for 6 months? Dave did. And when I was going through my divorce, who took me out for drinks every night? Dave did." Greg's speech was a rambling, heartfelt mess, filled with anecdotes that painted Dave as a saint and himself as a lovable screw-up. The highlight, though, was his closing wish for the newlyweds. "And my biggest hope for you two," he said, his eyes glassy with emotion, "is that you'll stop arguing so much. Seriously, guys, just stop. Love each other and all that." The room erupted in laughter and applause, partly out of relief that the speech was over and partly because, despite the drunken delivery, Greg's words were genuine. Dave clapped Greg on the back, and Lisa gave him a hug, her eyes sparkling with amusement. By this point, it was clear that this was the drunkest wedding I had ever attended. But the night wasn't over yet. As the party began to wind down at the restaurant, Lisa made a suggestion that took everyone by surprise. "Hey, we've got a suite at the hotel near BWI Airport," she announced. "Our flight's early in the morning, but we don't have to sleep yet. Why don't we all head over there and keep the party going?" Sarah and I exchanged glances. It was already late, but we figured, why not? It wasn't every day that you got to witness something like this, and we were invested in seeing how the night would unfold. A caravan of cars made its way to the hotel, with Lisa and Dave leading the way. When we arrived at the hotel, the lobby was surprisingly quiet for such a late hour. As we walked in, another bride caught my eye. She was standing off to the side while her husband checked them in at the front desk. She looked exhausted, holding her bouquet limply, her dress slightly askew as if she had been wearing it for far too long. The juxtaposition was striking. Here was another bride, clearly at the end of her big day, while Lisa and her entourage were just ramping up for the after-party. The bride glanced at us with a mix of curiosity and weariness, probably wondering what kind of group she had just encountered. Lisa, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the other bride's situation, led us all to the elevators. The suite was on one of the higher floors, and as the doors opened, we spilled out into the hallway, laughter echoing off the walls. The suite itself was spacious, with a living area that had been quickly transformed into a makeshift party zone. Someone had brought a boombox, and music was already playing. More drinks were poured, and the revelry resumed with renewed vigor. Greg, still riding high from his speech, became the unofficial master of ceremonies. He challenged Dave to a series of increasingly ridiculous dares, from chugging contests to impromptu dance-offs. Lisa, meanwhile, had kicked off her shoes and was swaying to the music, her face flushed with happiness. As the night wore on, I found myself sitting on the edge of one of the couches, watching the chaos with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Sarah was next to me, resting her head on my shoulder, her eyes half closed, but still smiling. "This is something else," I murmured to her. She nodded, not even bothering to open her eyes. "It's like a train wreck you can't look away from." Around 3 in the morning, the party finally started to wind down. People were sprawled out on the floor, draped over furniture, or quietly slipping out the door to head back to their own rooms. Lisa and Dave had collapsed together on one of the beds, holding hands even as they slept. Sarah and I decided it was time to call it a night. We said our goodbyes, quietly slipping out of the suite and making our way back to our car. The hotel lobby was deserted now, the other bride and her husband long gone. As we were about to leave the hotel lobby, something unexpected happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lisa, who had been drinking heavily, teeter over towards the other bride. At first, I thought she was going to congratulate her or share a few kind words, but it quickly became clear that Lisa was not in the state for pleasantries. She stumbled up to the woman and slurred, "Hey, you think you're the only bride here tonight? You're an ugly flipping bad person. I'm the good-looking bride." The room seemed to freeze for a moment as everyone turned to look at the unfolding drama. The other bride, already looking exhausted and at the end of her patience, wasn't about to take this lying down. Her face turned a shade of red that was almost impressive, and she shot back, "Excuse me? Who the hell do you think you are?" It escalated quickly. Lisa, emboldened by her liquid courage, got even closer, pointing a wobbly finger in the other bride's face. "I'm the real bride here. You're just a wannabe." The tension in the lobby was palpable. The other bride took a step forward, eyes blazing with anger. "Listen, you drunk mess, back off before I make you regret it." For a split second, I thought a real fight was about to break out. The two women were chest to chest, and it wouldn't take much for the situation to spiral out of control. Guests and hotel staff were starting to gather, looking on with a mix of concern and curiosity. At that moment, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Let's go," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and urgency. I didn't need to be told twice. We hurried out of the lobby, the sounds of the confrontation fading behind us. As we got to our car, we could still hear faint shouts and commotion from inside the hotel. We drove home in silence for a while, the adrenaline still pumping through our veins. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I can't believe that just happened," she said, shaking her head. "Lisa was so out of control." "Yeah," I agreed, glancing over at her. "That was intense. I hope it doesn't get any worse for her." We spent the rest of the drive processing the evening's events. It had started as a chaotic but joyful celebration and ended with a near brawl in a hotel lobby. It was clear that Lisa's journey was far from over, and there were still many challenges ahead. The next day, Sarah called Lisa to check on her. She was groggy and hungover, but seemed to be in relatively good spirits. She didn't remember much of the incident with the other bride, which was probably for the best. Dave, ever the supportive partner, had taken care of her and made sure she got home safe.